Break the ice. Actually, going back to the very beginning, Alfred, the known knowns being unclear. I love that idea, and I think striving for more common vocabulary use is part of that. But I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about, is this a communication breakdown, or is it because we don't have that many known knowns?
I think it's probably both. My sense is that the research community should have some common understanding of what they think the known knowns are, and then begin to communicate that. And part of the communication also is developing a vocabulary among the researchers, but the vocabulary for sharing the results with the stakeholders is going to be different. So effect size, right? We can talk about that at the research level, but then how do you communicate? We see results coming out all the time, and stakeholders are saying, well, there's this research study that came out that shows this intervention is effective for learning. But then how do you explain or educate our stakeholders on not all research results are the same, right? So effect size is a good example of that.
There are so many questions about the assumptions made in the scenarios behind those experiments that people don't know if they're comfortable with saying that also works in a higher level graduate course as well as with a beginning statistics class where the cognitive model is easier to describe or more well known at the very least. And so I cannot give people comfort on that generalizability, and therefore there are no paradigms, paradigmatic models that people can then roll out and say that's a good way to go. And there's no map, there's no course, and so we are all just looking around.
Hi, I'm Lawrence. I work with the National Society of Black Physicists. So I have a couple of questions with respect to a point that you made about faculty trying to get back to research. Does delivering a course in a MOOC environment, does it reduce the number of FTEs that you have to use to teach that general physics course? And does the analytics you get, we believe that the idea is that it gives you, the teacher, better analytics, and that's a value added? I mean, how do you justify all of this to the provost's office, for instance?
So I'm the office that it has to be justified to at MIT. And I will answer your question, which is a very insightful and important question, especially with regard to the level of effort and the fact that we have finite resources and we have to allocate them in different ways. Absolutely. But let me try to make it not a zero-sum game by describing a beautiful example of how it's happening in graduate education. One of our physics faculty is teaching an atomic physics MOOC this semester on edX. And his name is Wolfgang Ketterle, and he's a Nobel Prize winner in physics. And you may know him from his appearances in front of the National Black Physicists Associations. And he loves this MOOC and is doing it from the fact that he's also finding this not just a way to give back to the community, but a way to improve research. And that this is going to accelerate the pace of discovery and innovation in his field of atomic physics by bringing more people into the field, but by also having the community ask him questions about things in ways that he's never thought of before. We're seeing some of our MOOC instructors reporting that they're writing research papers that were spawned by discussions that were happening in the forums. This is beautiful. This is a different value proposition than we have heard by and large from MOOCs, and that's where a lot of our hope and attention is moving to for changing the basic value proposition.
But as you and I talked, the issue of when did he decide to launch work like this? Because we speak about people not being able to expand the power of their teaching till after they're tenured, which is often dependent on their research. And so one is that, because we still, in our structure of higher ed, so value the research over the teaching. The faculty say, well, I don't want to teach, or I'll have my TAs do the teaching, or yada, yada, and I'll do the research because that's where we evaluate them. So you said it was after he got his
Nobel
tenure
Prize.
and Nobel Prize. Then he was golden. He could go do what he wanted to do, what his passion was.
I had two questions. One for Carolyn. I'm just wondering, you described that two-step process by which you were determining membership and effective collaboration within the teams afterwards. And the primary example was versus a self-selected, a randomized selection versus the one that you came up with via the pre-test or the pre-interaction sequences that you examined to match people. Did you do something with respect to self-selected teams? Because in classes, most of the time we find the students want to self-select the people they want to be in their teams with, either because they're from the same fraternity or because they're from the same cohort in some other social context. And so I'm just curious to know whether that was one of the elements. And I have another question for Ike after that.
Okay, let me answer that question first. So, first of all, so I said random, but random is a slight misnomer because actually we were assigning people to jigsaw teams. The jigsaw aspect of the assignment was true in both conditions, though. So, as part of the preparation for the pre-activity, students were instructed in one of 4 different areas that were relevant for their projects. And this is known to be a very effective paradigm for assigning students to teams for team-based learning. And it is true, actually, in many classes, the teachers assign students to their teams. But in team-based MOOCs, it is actually common practice for students to be required to pick their team. But in our analysis of data from a couple of courses that we had access to was that students actually found this very difficult, and that the affordances for being able to pick out team members are very underdeveloped. Because, let's say you're in a class, 60,000 students are enrolled. How do you look through a list of 60,000 profiles to find the people who you really want to interact with? And so because of that, we didn't consider as part of our study to have a self-selected condition. So I think that I would be happy to investigate that further once there are better affordances for students to actually select their teams.
So, Ike, you mentioned that they did this a large-scale item analysis, that when you presented that back to faculty, the reaction seemed to be, huh? Or what do we do with this? And so, but you didn't follow that with what you decided you should do with this, or the next step from your perspective on that. And I'd like you to elaborate on it.
Thanks, Phil, for the question. I think the most interesting follow-on is that we have discovered that the most useful part of our analytics package to instructors is common wrong answer response lists. What are the common answers that people put in that were actually wrong? And I'm very delighted that the edX platform is now able to, or shortly soon going to be able to, also show the same kind of data. By the way, all of this is made possible by the fact that MIT and Harvard have built our own separate parallel analytics platform, and we don't use the one that edX provides.
I had a question for Professor Shuang. I think you almost answered my question at the very end there, but I love the way you talk about your professors getting feedback from the students. Have you started noticing it affecting their instructional and course design and maybe pedagogical approach?
No.
Would you, well, all right, I'm going to ask, how soon do you think you will get there inside MIT?
I think that the faculty are probably not going to change their instructional design so quickly as well our instructional staff.
Okay.
So our digital learning scientists and MITx fellows are really the frontline people who are leading that kind of innovation. And institutionally, we see that we need this kind of a buffer between. Our faculty are actually extremely stressed. We have far too high of a student-to-teacher ratio compared with our historical norms in computer science. For example, these popular large growing classes. Machine learning had 280 students come out of the blue because they all want to get funded by you, the VCs.
And my second question was with the tools that are available. I mean, you are MIT and Stanford. You can build the parallel analytics and your own instances. But for the rest of the market out there, how far do you see any tools out there that can help even sort of emulate what you guys are doing?
I was at Davidson College and part of a liberal arts collaborative. I have adopted the tools developed by MIT and Harvard for all those institutions. Right?
So
They cost
the
way-
answer is open source.
Yes.
All of what we're doing in this area is open source, and we want it to remain that way.
And I'm going to just really quickly interject. Maybe we can take this to lunch, but I'm super interested, Taylor, what you're doing at the NSF. It's a very unstructured question, but I'm sort of curious about sort of policy forming around big data and also around learning analytics and what the thoughts are. We're in DC, right? So
We are in
apologies
DC,
for the
that's for
unstructured
sure.
question.
Well, one answer to that is I'm sure many of you have been involved in the variety of efforts across government right now to bring in big data, bring in analytics, bring in insight to inform every single directorate at NSF and many other government agencies. So what are we doing in big data? So we actually have a program, it's called Critical Technologies and Techniques in blah, 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 blah. The short acronym is big data. So that program is the one that very much is focusing on, I would say, a step beyond just our learning analytics, which tend to be smaller and tend to be, now we're growing out of that, yes, but really is taking the jump to big data techniques and technologies. And so that's part of the reason for the focus that I talk about quite a bit on being able to find out how to safely and reliably share data, code, et cetera, tools, things like that. There's other foci, like other places in the foundation. So throughout education, throughout the EHR Directorate, which is Education and Human Resources, we have big data or analytics built into several of our programs. So at whatever scale this is happening, take a look at programs and talk to program officers at your space, because at your institution, whatever that happens to be. For instance, with the EHR core program, which is our core research program, we have a whole panel now this year on what I would call big data /EDM /learning analytics proposals. Last year we didn't have any panel, so it's a growing foci in EHR in a variety of programs. There's a lot of interest in it in citizen science, right? Obviously in MOOCs, but in not MOOCs per se, but how MOOCs can enable collaboration, right? How MOOCs can enable understanding and building understanding of critical learning phenomena. So far, as we've talked about, and I'm sure everybody will talk about a lot more today, a whole lot of things we've known in learning science about the best learning environments haven't been so easy to implement in MOOCs, and so we haven't implemented. But that's changing. Personalization, collaboration, all kinds of good stuff that we know about good learning environments. The ability to have hands-on, quote, experiences in terms of virtual labs, et cetera. So a lot of that's going to change, I think, in the next 10 years about MOOCs. And so there's some very exciting research opportunities there to do big data, or at least large-scale research on learning phenomena that prior to now have primarily been studied in small classroom studies. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you.
And if anybody wants to ask me questions at lunch, please go ahead.
Yeah, can I ask one? So, just the microcosm of Stanford, we try to get together the learning science students and the CS students, and it's not totally easy to do. They have a slightly different language, but it's really fruitful when it happens. And do you at NSF now or plan to try explicitly to bring those two communities together, maybe with calls that kind of require collaboration?
So in what I've funded this year, not myself personally, but through my portfolio, we have a few workshops that are starting to do that. And so I think there's some very exciting work. Cindy Mello Silver is doing some great stuff. Marcella Worsley doing some great stuff in very different areas on Carolyn, Ken, I'll just keep pointing around the room if you want, doing some great work in areas where we're saying, all right, we have a group of people. So Cindy's is kind of one of my favorite classic examples, because here's a person who's been doing collaboration research in classrooms. She's got 30 years of coded videotapes, kind of your ground truth, if you will, right? So you've got really clear learning scientists who understand the phenomenon. They've got data that we can use as background, as our validation set, right? And then we have some maybe sparser data from where we have a really large amount of it from, say, MOOCs and collaboration sites. So can we start getting those together? So she's going to be running a series of workshops to start pulling together the right people on both sides of those. Matthew Berlin and the crew at University of Wisconsin is doing some very similar stuff through the Building Community Capacity program around game data, bringing together data scientists and people who've been, have great data and have been studying game learning in STEM for a long time to try to start building those partnerships and building that understanding.
I really liked Andreas's idea of the LMS as a recommendation engine, but with so many MOOCs kind of modeled after the traditional, sage on a stage, I wonder if there's a space to have more of a unconference style course in which the students themselves are making the recommendations, and there's a curation process where students upvote or downvote recommendations, and almost like a wiki-like approach to building a course. I'd love to hear thoughts from the panel on that idea.
There's actually on November 19th, there's an NSF deadline for proposals, and so they'll get one, at least on this topic from us. I think going forward, that is really exciting. I'm not sure whether the current technology is supported sufficiently, but we've been talking several times now of the LMS 2.0. There are a lot of people working on augmentations. There is the LTI standards that maybe is a little narrow band right now, but hopefully we can use it to at least do experiments towards that.
So if I could just add to that a little bit. So one example of a kind of environment that sort of fits that paradigm, but of course is still, in its developmental stages, is work that George Siemens and Dragan Geshevich have done on ProSolo. And we had integrated that with the edX platform in some way. We'd like to do a better integration in the future in a course that we had offered jointly last fall. And the idea there really is that students are setting goals for themselves, and then they can follow each other and observe these goals. And as they build more connections within that network. In some ways, it is a little bit like this unconference style of, emerging little sub-communities. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make it work a little bit better, but we have been working with them also on this idea of building in recommendation for getting these teams together better, that people will find people who they like to interact with, but also who are good role models and who can further their learning objectives better. So I think it's a wide open space.
One of the nicest pieces of work Daniel Seaton is known for is his study showing that between 30 and 40% of the users of MITx and HarvardX MOOCs are teachers. So we have a large population of teachers taking these. They're not students, by and large, of the normal sense. They're teachers who want to learn the material to be able to use it in their own classroom, and I think they would probably be very interested in being able to mash up the content and reuse it. MIT Office of Digital Learning has a lot of its source content on GitHub, and I invite you to look for LORE, Learning Objects Repository for Education, which is our nascent, budding effort on try to make edX content, source material, reusable by other educators.
LMS is a recommending system. I think that might be not the most fruitful way of looking at things. Having worked in my previous incarnation for an LMS company. So I think the idea suggests that we have this monolithic thing called the LMS. And also there's this homogeneous concept called recommendation. Whereas I think what we need to be moving towards is more of a interoperable world where standards such as IMS, Caliper, learning tools, interoperability. So I'm not persuaded that this is a good way of thinking about it, because it suggests the idea that there's going to be this monolithic thing, And then even the idea of because what do we mean by recommendation? I'm working on a homework problem and I'm stuck, so you're going to give me a recommendation. That's one type of recommendation. There's other types of recommendation in adaptive systems. What am I ready to learn next? That's another type of recommendation. So I want to kind of deconstruct that idea that might be a bad way to think of, because LMS suggests this monolithic system, and then recommendation is just this one idea. Right? So,
By the way, that can be turned into a nice challenge. So let me lay down a gauntlet for edX. How about, forget about just recommendation, how about just search? There is no, I know it's coming, it keeps on coming. Let's get search coming.
Hi, Timo Kos from Delft University in the Netherlands. Maybe to add on the recommendation thing, there's a small company startup that we funded from Delft, a student startup, and it's called Feedback Fruits, and it's students recommending courseware to each other, voting it up, voting it down, and collaboration around it. And there are also the guys that won a hackathon on OpenEdX to create a Creative Commons button into your edX that you can license anything for use, remix. So it's interesting to look at, and it's got an API, you can integrate it with any LMS. So something to look at.
Nice.
A couple of things I think were alluded to, the whole notion of disaggregated content and the notion of interoperability. It adds a vector to this that changes the way you create content and consume content, and we don't think about that. I mean, what's the downstream implications of interoperability for the content that we create? We tend to look at things through the lens of a single platform as opposed to an ecosystem. But I see, content developers, instructional designers are going to be impacted greatly by this, and we have to use that as an additional lens. And I was just kind of curious, there seems to be multiple standards, but we don't spend as much time maybe on the interoperability standards that we need to within this ecosystem. And any recommendations for anything we should support, like XAPI and LTI and others?
I'd like to take that one on just from an industry perspective. I think you said the key word. It's ecosystem. That says no provider, whether it's open, proprietary, is going to be the source. So that's number one. Number two, we firmly believe that advances in learning will take place from an ecosystem. And what has to be open in that ecosystem are standards. Standards from everything for data interoperability, which is we are investing and believe firmly in Caliper. You have to place some bets. So we're placing bets that the IMS Global Consortium is the de facto standards body in educational technology. So LTI, Caliper, whatever the standards are coming out. And if we don't like the standards, participate in defining those standards. So.
I can also speak towards standards. And by the way, we enthusiastically endorse the idea of ecosystems rather than single platforms, and especially the notion of open source. Now, in terms of standards, one of the most promising standards that MIT sees on the horizon is a standard for this that's kind of known today as OLX, or the XML standard that edX is based on. It has a long history. It goes back to Lon Kappa, a beautiful piece of work that laid forth a lot of extensions to what IMA has already had. And we believe that this OLX or XML that edX uses, if there's standardization on this, it can be almost as if the common meeting point, like Word has XML output. And that extension is as if just adding questions, interactive questions, to normal Word documents. And that notion of having that capability of interactivity in a common standard where then any authoring platform can produce that, and then many consuming LMSs can display that, or also interconvert it to other platforms, is extremely compelling, and I think very much a good future to have.